about is that we're here just 6 weeks and 1 day before Election Day 2012. We're going to have early voting starting later this week in some of the states, North Carolina and Iowa and so forth. I like to look back, try to put things in at least some historic perspective before getting into the minutiae of the latest polls that we've been getting and all that sort of thing. And I think one of the things I like to do is look at the numbers and look at the voting behavior. And one of the things I've noticed is that in the period from 1995 to 2005, voting behavior in the United States was unusually stable. If you looked at the percentage of popular vote for House of Representatives, which since the mid-90s has been a pretty good proxy for support of the president and his party. What you've seen is that the Republican percentages, the Democratic percentages varied only within a very narrow band of 3% in 5 straight elections. That's highly unusual. We haven't had such stability in House popular vote since the 1880s, and unfortunately no one in Washington has any memory of the 1880s now that Strom Thurmond is gone. He had a very clear memory of the 1880s. It was the 1980s he was a little hazy about. And so that was that was a period I call trench warfare politics. The two parties, the voting patterns, voting behavior was rooted in strong religious or moral beliefs. The demographic variable most highly correlated with voting behavior was religion or a degree of religiosity within each sectarian group, and that percentage continued. In fact, continued. That period of trench warfare politics continued until about the summer of 2005, as American television viewers watched scenes of disorder and disarray in the streets of Baghdad and the streets of New Orleans. And since then, American politics has been what I call a period of open field politics, in which political preferences have oscillated within a historically wide band of 9%, if you look at the popular vote for the House percentages for each party. And we've had record performances for both political parties. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected president with 53% of the popular vote. That was more than any other Democratic nominee in history except Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. It was more even than Bill Clinton, although I suggest you not bring up that fact if you happen to have a personal conversation with President Clinton. If you take a look at the House popular vote, the House popular vote in the 36 non-Southern states, the Democratic Party beat the Republicans by a margin of 57 to 40. That's the best the Democratic Party has ever done in the 36 non-Southern states in a House election since they started contesting elections in 1832. So that's a long period of time. It's an historic record. Then in 2010, the Republicans won the House popular vote by a 52-49 margin. And that was their best showing. It was similar to 1994, the best they've done since 1946, equivalent to what they were getting in the Republican heyday of the 1920s. Among white voters, who were 77% of the electorate, the Republicans' popular vote margin was 60% to 37%. That's the biggest popular vote margin for Republicans among white voters that they've ever gotten since they started contesting elections in 1854. So that, in turn, was a historic election. And that 9% shift in the party's percentages between the 2008 and 2010 election, 9% doesn't sound like a lot, perhaps. It's a single integer. But 9%, that was the biggest change that we've seen in House popular vote since 1946 and 48. And I think it's significant that in those two elections, Americans were faced with the same basic issue that they were faced with in 2010, with Democrats calling for and favoring, Republicans opposing a vast increase in the size and scope of government. If you go back to Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 State of the Union address, I warned you there'd be some historical perspective here, he called for a bigger government, continuation of wartime wage and price controls, very high tax rates, a continuation of government support of unionization, of the union organizing strikes, government provision of most housing and federal aid to education, The thought was then that the private sector really just can't build housing. You've got to have the government step in and do it. And his successor, Harry Truman, endorsed that program. But in 1946, after a year in which there were more labor union strikes than any time in our history, voters responded to the Republican slogan of "had enough" and elected a Republican Congress. President Truman called that a do-nothing Congress. In fact, it did a whole lot. They got rid of wage and price controls. They enacted one of the largest tax cuts in American history, limited union powers in the Taft-Hartley Act, passed over the veto of President Truman, and rejected government control of housing and education. Democrats won back their majority in 48, but most Southern and many Northern Democrats didn't favor that FDR program and did not support reversal of the 80th Congress legislation. And its policies endured, some for a generation, some to the present day, much longer. Pardon me, it's really in that series of elections that Americans took one course while our Anglosphere cousins in the United Kingdom were taking another course after the election of the Labour government in 1945 that nationalized industries, they had the National Health Service, and provided other welfare state protections. I just get a little water there, it'd be great. President Obama and the Democratic supermajorities in Congress and their leaders, the Obama Democrats, if you will, came to office with the assumption, and it's the lesson that's been taught by the great popular historians of the New Deal, that economic distress would make Americans more supportive of or amenable to a vast increase in the size and scope of government. I took a different view of the political and public opinion events of the 1930s in a book I wrote called Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan. It's readily, it was a view did not find favor with many people. At last I looked on Amazon, you could buy a copy of the book for 11 cents. But I took a different view of the 1930s. But in any case, I think that assumption, whatever the result of the election, has been proved to be wrong insofar as any abstract assumption can be proved wrong in the world of everyday, real world of politics. The stimulus and the package in Obamacare, or if you want to call it the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, remain so unpopular that Obama practically never mentions them. You didn't hear much about them in his acceptance speech and the primetime speeches in Charlotte. You'd have to think that the only domestic accomplishment of the legislation, of the administration, was saving General Motors. The slowness of our current recovery left Obama having to rope in Bill Clinton to make a convention speech, one which apparently got better ratings than his own, in which the former president made the argument that nobody could have done better. And so Democrats have been reduced to campaigning on peripheral issues or rallying the different groups that make up their party's coalition.